I'm learning! How was your walk?
Pretty good. How are you?
Good. We're going to go live in about 5, so.
I guess I'll have some cereal then.
Be quick. My partner wants to eat food. 'Cause, like, life.
How dare.
I know, right? And now he's making fun of me. Which he should. I guess.
Happy that people asked about things. I was happy that people asked about things in the Discord.
It looked like you had a really good conversation brewing there.
Yeah, I'm always hesitant to jump in when people talk about oral histories because my job is to think that they're all valid until I learn otherwise.
I mean, it's just the assumption we should have.
Yeah. Oh,
as archaeologists, we know how this works, you know?
Yeah.
We understand that there can be multiple realities existing at the same time. One can be factually correct and the other can be orally correct. It's fine.
Mm-hmm.
Still not aliens.
Still not aliens.
Still not aliens.
That was the running joke when we were in the field last week, was that it was aliens.
Find a lot of aliens, did you? Little mummified green men.
We found jack shit, which was what was weird.
I never find crap in phase 1s anymore. Like, I mean, I do sometimes, but it's very rare. Like, most of the time when you're doing a phase 1, you're just digging holes. Uh-oh, did I lose you? Hey, no, there you are. Maybe.
I got a call and it went through my iPad, so I hope that doesn't happen very many times.
But that's okay. Problem. I think it was on the Women in Archaeology podcast where got a call, it went through their pad.
At least if I shut it off, it goes away. What was I gonna say? Yeah, we dug a 12 by 12 meter grid and then put a 7-foot trench through it.
And you found nothing?
Nothing. Not even rocks.
Which
was why it was because we were on the 3rd terrace at an archaeological site.
And you didn't even find rocks?
Nothing. The actual archaeologists, I should say.
You're an actual archaeologist.
That were the PIs on the dig, think it might have been an area for ridge and furrow agriculture.
Yeah.
Literally nothing, because there were a couple of things that we found that looked like plow scars, but they were too deep to be in the actual plow zone.
That doesn't mean they're not plow scars.
No, it doesn't.
Fun thing about plow scars.
They took a ton of floats, and we'll just see.
All right. We got 2 people viewing. We are live. So.
Live.
It probably will degrade into CRM chatting, yes. Do you have the Twitch pulled up to see the chat stream?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, so I'm just talking to archaeologistic.
Yes, I can see that too. And answer questions there.
I have a bad habit of just like randomly talking to people. Oh, no, I don't want to do that. Things making noise in my kitchen. But anyway. Hey everybody, and welcome to the very first ever live Archaeological Fantasies podcast episode. We will hopefully be turning the audio of this into an actual podcast for later release, but I really wanted to go live with this particular topic today because I have with me Dr. Krystiana Krupa, who is coming here to talk to us about the 30th anniversary of the Nagpra law. And for people who don't know what Nagpra stands for, I'm going to try really hard not to butcher it, but it is the Native Americans Graves and Repatriation Act. It was a law that was signed 30 years ago, so it is the same age as I am, and it was kind of a game changer in a lot of ways, and we have strong opinions about it
We
because
do.
we're archaeologists, and that's what we do. We bitch about things. So, Dr. Krupa, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and your acquaintance with the Nagpra law?
Sure. So I'm, like she said, I'm Krystiana Krupa. I am the Nagpra program officer at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So my experience with Nagpra is that it's my job, my full-time job, I should say, which is relatively uncommon, and we can talk a little bit about why
That is
that's
also true,
important.
yes.
So I have been at Illinois since June of this year. So the university didn't have a NAGPRA office until June of this year. Well, I think technically it was January, but I was hired in June. Um, so I've been in my position since then, and before that, I worked with the NAGPRA office at Indiana University. So I was doing NAGPRA for a little while before this,
I
and
oh, keep going. No, no, keep going.
yeah. Oh, I was just gonna say, so I've worked in NAGPRA personally exclusively in the Midwest. So most of my experience comes from collections that were excavated from the Midwest and tribes that were removed from the Midwest.
I I love that you are stuck where you're at because I have my alma mater is Indiana U, and I've worked for Champaign Urbana, which is where you're at now. So it's just like you're following me. Um, I don't I don't think you're gonna find I don't think you're gonna interact with any of the stuff that I dug at any point because I didn't. Well, did you do anything with the Angel Mounds collections?
Yes.
Yeah, so I worked on the Angel Mounds collections a long time ago now.
Yes, that's the largest archaeological collection that Indiana University houses,
Yes,
which I'm sure you know.
they're very proud of it.
Yeah.
And the Angel Mounds excavation that I participated in was one of the field schools. I think it was one of the last field schools they had out there. Um, really enjoyed it. Was a fabulous experience. We actually had an interesting run in with Nagpra ish while we were digging because there was rumors that we had found human remains or burials and that we were not treating them properly, and
Mm.
that was not true. We did neither of those things. There were no human remains and there were no burials, but um, we did have to do some damage control.
Sure.
Fortunately, I was just a graduate. I didn't have to do any of it myself, so thanks for everybody.
Yeah.
Um, but we are talking about the NACRA law. So I want to give a real brief overview of what NAGPRA is, just mainly because Ken and Jeb and I have talked about NAGPRA before on the show, on the podcast, but new faces this time, and I know we've got a couple people who might be joining us in the chat. Um, People are allowed to come into the general chat and chat with us live. Just don't use your camera, please. I think it'll screw up my setup. And if you do accidentally use your camera, it's fine. I'll figure it out. But um, one of the questions we had from a couple people was, what exactly is NAGPRA? And I'd like to talk about it not in legalese, if that's possible.
Mm. Sure.
It's got a lot of fancy
Yeah.
words in it, but that doesn't necessarily mean people understand what it says. So I'm gonna let you do it
Yeah.
because that's why you're here.
So I'm going to only slightly correct you about the acronym. So
See?
NAGPRA is the Native it's the Native American Graves Protection and
Protection.
Repatriation Act. Forgot the P, but that's okay. People mix up letters in the acronym all the time, so
It's a long acronym, to be fair.
it is. So, um, what NAGPRA does in terms of archaeological collections and the repatriation of archaeological collections is, as a law, it provides a standardized legal process which is very complicated, but I won't describe in legalese because that's not the point of right now.
No.
It provides a legal process for federally recognized tribes in the United States to claim and repatriate, which means return, basically, their ancestors and cultural objects to their either lineal descendants or descendant communities. And that wasn't required. There was no process for that before the law was passed in 1990, which is 30 years ago today. So I always like to joke about how it's kind of ridiculous that I'm a regional expert in a law that's older than I am because I'm not quite 30.
Oh, wow.
So
Thanks.
that's so that no, that's just like, it is for a field. It is kind of I don't want to say anything mean, but it's surprising that I should be one of the people that knows the most about this law, considering it was passed before I was born.
Right.
I should not be the person that knows more about this than most of the people that do archaeology in the Midwest.
Well, and the other thing that people don't normally know about Nagpra is there were a couple, not laws, but like ordinances that were kind of being cobbled together before Nagpra was officially written and passed. So
Mhm.
it's not like it was something that, 1990 rolled around and people were like, "Hey, we should just like create a law, you guys." It had been something in the works. Like I said, we have opinions. We'll get to those, I promise you. A couple interesting things about that you mentioned about the Nagpra law was the repatriation of tribal objects, ancestral objects, which is everything that isn't people. I don't think a lot of people understand that objects are also part of the repatriation process. Oh crap, and I completely
Sure.
forgot what the second thing was. It'll come to me.
I can talk about that while you think about
Oh,
it if you
no,
want.
that's what it was. Federally recognized tribes. That was the key word there. So,
Yeah.
which one do you want to talk about first? Objects or federal?
Let's talk about cultural items first.
Let's talk about cultural
Um,
items.
so NAGPRA requires the consultation about and repatriation of, if that's appropriate, Native American ancestral remains and cultural items. And so ancestral remains are basically just what it sounds like. It's human remains. They're usually skeletal remains. But cultural items is a category, or it's an umbrella term sort of for multiple categories of objects under the law. And those include funerary objects, which are things that are buried with people. That includes sacred objects, sacred or ceremonial objects, which are typically used for religious practice. And that includes objects of cultural patrimony. And what that means is that these are objects that belong to a tribe as a whole instead of being an individual person's property. So one of my colleagues really likes to use an example that something like an object of cultural patrimony for white Americans would be something like the U.S. Constitution, where we sort of feel a collective sense of ownership over something like that rather than it belonging to one specific person. So in terms of the categories of things that are covered under NAGPRA, those categories of objects and also ancestral human remains are what the law applies to.
And the key to NAGPRA is federal recognition. And there are under 200 tribes that are federally recognized right now.
Oh no, it's like I think the last number I read was 574.
There we go. Okay, 574. And there's not a handful. There are several tribes that are not federally recognized who are working towards recognition or who have organized and are just like your federal recognition. Now, being recognized by the United States federal government isn't that easy anymore, I guess. I don't know. Do you know what the process is that they have to go through to become a federally recognized tribe?
I don't know a lot of specifics about the process, but
Okay.
it's very complicated and it requires effectively an outrageous amount of evidence. And one of the things that makes it difficult for a lot of communities is that you have to show basically unbroken cultural continuity through time.
Wow. Okay.
Which a lot of tribes, because of a variety of things caused by colonialism, are not able to do that. And so that's the issue sometimes with federal recognition. Of course, there are a variety of reasons that a tribe might not be federally recognized, but that is a big component of that. And so there are certainly plenty of tribes and communities that don't have federal recognition, but NAGPRA is specific to the ones that do have federal recognition, and there are, like I said, hundreds of those
Yeah.
already.
And just because we only recognize the few hundreds that we do, there were thousands of tribes before we started consolidating things. Um, so the tribes that are recognized today are just a fraction of the tribes, the potential tribes that should be recognized. I just throwing it out there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so you're working mostly in the Midwest, and I think it's fun that you were like, oh yeah, I shouldn't be the expert in the Midwest or an expert in the Midwest. What was it like working in Indiana? Because when I was there, the state of Indiana did not recognize any tribes. So how did that affect your work with NAGPRA there?
Yeah, so this, I'll just say right now that I can apply this to Indiana and Illinois and a lot of the Midwest and Southeast as well. So NAGPRA is difficult in removal states. And that is something that was definitely true in Indiana, but is also true in Illinois and in a lot of other parts of the
What's
country.
a removal state? I think I know what you
So,
mean. What's a removal state?
yeah, sure. So, removal being Indian removal, the forced process of removing tribes from their homelands and sending them out west.
That's what I thought you meant. Okay.
Yes. So that makes NAGPRA very complicated because it makes affiliating archaeological or other ethnographic collections with living tribal communities complicated because they don't live where their ancestors lived. And so that's not true in other parts of the country. For example, there are plenty of tribes in the Pacific Northwest or in the Southwest whose reservation land is on their ancestral territory. And so you don't always, but often have at least a vague sense of which communities lived where. And that's really difficult in the Midwest. And you're right. Indiana does not have any federally recognized tribes. There is one band of Potawatomi who is recognized as, I don't want to specify which band because I can't remember who it is and I don't want to get it wrong, but one of the Potawatomi bands is recognized as the tribe of both Michigan and Indiana, but their tribal headquarters are in Michigan.
Yeah,
So they're
remember
really
that.
recognized. Um, Illinois also has no federally recognized
I
tribes.
wondered. I couldn't remember if Illinois did or not. So
Yeah, so that means that if you are consulting, this is something that I experienced when I was working in Indiana. If you consult on an archaeological collection from the state of Indiana and you don't know um, who that who that collection should go to, you have to consult with all of the tribes who ever lived in Indiana, of which we figured out there were 53
okay. Well, you
we
got a
know of.
number.
Yeah, that we know of. And so that's where you start. You
So
start by contacting 53 different communities.
so this is interesting. The whole process of one of the things that people might know about NAGPRA, outside of our field, might know about NAGPRA is that NAGPRA, required us to give stuff back. That's the thing I hear a lot. And interestingly enough, that's the cover up of Giants. By the way, is NAGPRA. NAGPRA is part of the Giants cover up. Anyway, because people understand that NAGPRA was the law that went into effect that had a lot of museums giving things back, and also had a lot of colleges giving things back. Not NAGPRA doesn't cover everything though.
Mm-hmm.
NAGPRA only affects, is it federally funded?
Yeah, so it's any institution that has ever received federal funding,
Or wants to receive federal
and
funding.
applies it only applies to collections that are excavated from federal land.
Ah, there you go.
So if something, for example, if a burial site is encountered on private land, unless it becomes I hate to use this word, but the property of a federally funded institution,
Yeah.
then it is not NAGPRA. So it's pretty specific. I should say it applies to federally funded institutions and also to all federal agencies.
Mhm.
So, like the National Park Service, for example, is subject to NAGPRA.
Yeah. So Nagpra, when it originally went into effect, oh my God, I remember my college complaining about it, but it irritated people, and it irritated a lot of people for a lot of wrong reasons. But it was one of the first major laws that we put into effect to preserve Native American heritage in the states.
Hmm.
Um, and 30 years ago, it wasn't a perfect law.
That's true.
And I remember having arguments with some of my professors well, one in particular, when I was going through my undergrad, because when I read NAGPRA, I saw the flaws in NAGPRA, and I was like, this doesn't go far enough. It doesn't have enough protections. There's not enough ways for uh, tribes to petition or to fight a rejection. Because what people don't understand is that tribes petition for objects and they can be rejected. They
Mm,
can be told that they can't have that object for a myriad of reasons. Um,
absolutely true.
so it's not a failsafe. It's and personally, when I was reading it when I was an undergrad, I was like, oh, this doesn't sound that great. Here we are 30 years later, and has the law been updated since the 1990s?
Yeah. There actually was a set of regulations that were added to the law in 2010 that specifically addressed culturally unidentifiable collections. So in the 90s, after the law was passed, institutions were required to report any collections that fell under NAGPRA to the National Park Service, which is where the National NAGPRA program is housed. Um, and they were required to notify tribes that they thought might be affiliated with these collections of what they had. And they were required to go through the process of consultation, which is effectively communicating with tribes,
Right.
although consultation is interpreted in a variety of ways.
It's a
Um,
letter that you may or may not ever receive, but I sent
right.
it.
That's how a lot of consultations happened. Is universities or museums would send a letter to a tribe who at the time would have been inundated with letters. They got hundreds of letters from institutions all over the country about archaeological collections. Um, and so culturally affiliated collections, or those that were thought to be affiliatable
Mm.
with tribal communities, were required to be consulted on and repatriated. And that did not apply to collections or materials or ancestors that were culturally unidentifiable, which means that they could not be affiliated for whatever reason with a living tribal community.
Right.
And what ended up happening, frankly, was that institutions used that as a blanket way to not have to repatriate. They just decided that collections were culturally unidentifiable because
Oh,
they,
that was my
quote
shocked
unquote,
face.
right. Yeah. Like, they used it to say, oh, well, we're not sure which tribes that these things belonged to or whose ancestors these are. And so I guess we just ought to hang on to them forever. And eventually people were like, that was not the idea
Yeah,
behind this.
yeah.
And so in 2010, the additional regulations to the law were added to basically say, no, you actually have to follow this whole process for culturally unidentifiable collections. Also,
Yes.
um, that's the only update to the law since then. So we're now
Good.
10 years past. However, a couple of weeks ago, there was an amendment to NAGPRA that was dropped in Congress by Deb Haaland, um, which I can't remember which committee that's with right now, but it's with one of the House committees that makes a couple of changes to the law, but I have not actually personally been able to read that bill, and so I don't know the specifics. But I know that part of what it does is it increases the budget for NAGPRA fines, which is something that a lot of people have complained about, that basically NAGPRA doesn't have any teeth.
Yep. That was
Um,
one of my major bitches.
yeah, it also provides protection for confidential tribal information. Um,
Excuse me.
and so, like I said, I haven't read the bill, so I don't know exactly what that looks like, but that's another flaw of Nagpra's. And shoot, I can't remember what else it does. There are a couple of changes that it makes, um, that would be, if it got passed, the only additional updates to the law since 1990.
And I mean, on the one hand, understanding how laws get made, because I watched After School Special, and I understand that it takes a while for laws to get made, to get passed, and God help you if you want to change them, which is what's occurring.
Mm-hmm.
But laws like Nagpra wasn't, people were not happy with Nagpra when it was enacted. And it, not just because people are like, oh no, I have to give my stuff up. There were people who were pushing for the law to be passed who weren't pleased with the law because, like you said, it really doesn't have any teeth. There's too many loopholes, too many ways for people to get around giving things back. Um, I'll let you cover that question in chat. And I think it's great that there was an update to it so that the unrecognizable stuff had to be repatriated in some way, or at least attempted. And I'm looking forward to seeing if the new stuff goes through. We have a better chance now than we did the last
Yeah.
4 years. So, maybe.
Yeah, I'll see if I can find a link to that bill and I'll drop it to the chat.
Yeah, and I'll be putting a link to the actual NAGPRA federal page,
Mm-hmm.
people, when I finally get around to doing show notes. So, fingers
Yeah.
yes,
Okay.
fingers
So
crossed.
I can knock that question out.
Yeah.
So we have a question in the chat that says, also, if the remains are thought to belong to a non-federally recognized tribe, are they still considered CUI, which is culturally unidentifiable?
Okay, there we go.
Um, the short answer is yes. Um, there are a variety of ways that you can repatriate to a non-federally recognized tribe under NAGPRA. Um, one of those is that often state recognized or completely unrecognized tribes will form coalitions with tribes who are federally recognized. This
Smart.
happened in the case about the Ancient One, who is also known as Kennewick Man. At least one of the tribes that was involved in that consultation process was not federally recognized, but the federally recognized tribes that they worked with in the area recognized them as part of the process. And so they worked together
Nice.
in that whole case. So that's not the only situation where that's happened, but it's probably the best known one. You can also present a cultural affiliation report to the National NAGPRA Review Committee at the annual review committee meeting, and the review committee can make recommendations on whether they support the repatriation of those ancestors or collections to that tribe, even though they're not federally recognized. So there are cases where you can sort of work outside the law, but within its parameters to make that happen. There's also, of course, always the option to repatriate outside of NAGPRA,
Yeah, you can
which
just
places
repatriate.
you can just repatriate things. You don't have to follow the legal process
Yeah,
of NAGPRA.
you don't have to be a
Um,
dick, is what we're saying.
I mean, this is true, right? Also of international
Yeah.
archaeological material,
Yes.
um,
Yes.
which I can't remember who said this in our Discord server earlier, but somebody had asked, if at some point we could talk about parallels with other regions or similar things like that. You don't have to repatriate through a legal process. You can just repatriate things. But people don't like to do that. I always so my favorite example, which keeps coming up, international example, I should say, is that I can't count how many times now Greece has contacted the British Museum to be like, hey, the Parthenon marbles are actually Greek, and the Greeks would like to have those, and
Yeah,
the
but
British Museum no every time.
they don't have the thing that they need this time to
Yeah, that's
properly
what I hear.
curate the stuff.
That's what I hear.
Yeah.
And that's actually an argument that's used often in the U.S. too, is that
Yeah, I know.
things
Yeah.
should be repatriated because whichever community is requesting the repatriation, quote unquote, doesn't have the appropriate resources. And who cares? It's their stuff. They can do whatever they want with it.
And that's something that I always come back to with that. And it's actually a conversation that I'm still trying to like formulate how to have it. Is this is I hate those people who are like, oh, it's my history too because I'm an American. Like, yeah, okay, sit down, Tom. Um, but if a cultural group wants their stuff back, and when they get it back, all they want to do is grind it into dust and forget about it. Yeah, as a scientist and a researcher, I'm like, oh god, that's such a loss. But it's not my stuff. And if that cultural group doesn't want that stuff kept, um, should we really even be stepping in?
Well,
I
you
mean,
know,
yeah, it sucks to lose that stuff, but it's not ours.
I hear from a lot of people often that repatriating, frankly anything, but especially archaeological materials, is such a huge loss to science. You could do so much great research and you could find out so many great things about it.
Then
And
why haven't you?
as someone who was trained in anthropology, I recognize that there's a great benefit to research
Mhm.
from studying archaeological collections. But the point of Nagpra and the point of repatriation is that you prioritize the wishes of the descendant community over what it can benefit science from, like from doing. And so the argument is not that these things could not benefit science by researching them. The argument is that there are things that are more important than that.
Mhm. Mhm. And sovereignty is one of those things. Like,
Yes,
acknowledge.
absolutely. That's one of the things that Nagpra does that a lot of other laws don't do, right? It's federal Indian law, which, for people who might not know, is a very specific category of U.S. law that applies to federally recognized tribal nations.
Here in the
And
states.
it's,
Here in the states.
yes, in the states specifically, it explicitly recognizes tribal sovereignty by only applying to those sovereign nations. And Nagpra is one of those laws that falls under that category. And so Nagpra, by its placement within the U.S. federal law system, recognizes tribal sovereignty. And so this is one of the benefits of Nagpra. This is one of the things that Nagpra actually does well, is that it
Good.
promotes that sort of relationship, um, and the sort of government to government relationship that is required by those types of laws.
I think a lot of people have a hard time wrapping their head around the idea that um, Native American tribes here in the United States. I don't know how this works in Canada. Please don't come for me. Um, but the Native American tribes in the States are both sovereign nations and citizens of the United States. And I know that like screws with people's heads.
Mm-hmm.
And I can understand. Like I guess it's kind of confusing when it comes to things like, well, why do they vote? Well, because they're American citizens. They're allowed to pick their leaders. I mean, the
Mm-hmm.
president's the president. It's president of everyone. Um, so I don't have an easy way to explain that to people. I don't know if there really is one. It's just kind of one of those things where it's like you just really need to accept the fact that Native American tribes are sovereign governments and Native American people are United States citizens and they have the same rights. Um, yeah, Canada's messy and I don't know how it works. I also know that they're not referred to as Native Americans in Canada. They're usually referred to as First Peoples
First
and
Nations or
First Nations.
peoples.
Yeah, and so now you literally know everything I know about Native peoples in Canada. I'm sorry. It's just not something I encounter, so I just don't know enough about it.
Sure, if you don't work there, it's hard to
Yeah.
keep track of. It's plenty hard to keep track of all of these relevant
Oh yeah.
U.S.
I mean, I personally, as a CRM archaeologist, do not encounter. I don't think I've ever worked with a tribal monitor. If I did, they didn't identify themselves at the time. I have worked with people who were indigenous archaeologists,
Mm-hmm.
people who have heritage, and that's always interesting for me because I want to ask a million questions, but at the same time, I don't want them to feel like it's their job to be the representation of every Native American archaeologist that has ever existed because it's not. You're just the person who's in front of me at this moment when I have my questions. which it says a lot about me, not you. Um, but I am vaguely aware of what Nagpra does, and I am also beholden to the Section 106 laws and to the state laws that are very similar to Section 106, which do have some application to Native American finds, mainly because of Nagpra. Things
Hmm.
like if we discover human remains while we are digging, that's why the dig has to close, at least until the remains can be identified. Um, and that can affect a project pretty well. I mean, that can shut a project down, or you just kind of cordon that part off and move away from it. Either way,
Yeah.
the point is to preserve it and not destroy it. But the reason we do that is because of Nagpra.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that's we've been talking mostly about the repatriation part of NAGPRA, but there's also the grapes protection part of NAGPRA,
Right, right.
which you were just alluding to, which is that um, if you come upon what's called an inadvertent discovery or an unintentional discovery of usually human remains, you can't just dig them up anymore. That was not. There were state laws that suggested this or required this, depending on the state, before NAGPRA. But there was no federal law that actually protected Native American burial sites or individual burials. It didn't even have to be a site.
Mhm.
Before 1990, there weren't protections for that. And you know, this is it comes as a surprise to a lot of people, but you also have to remember that until, oh, I can't remember if it was 69 or 79, it was actually illegal to practice Native American religions in a country that was founded on freedom of religion.
I believe it was
Uh, it, it
79, but yeah.
it's not like these things were. It's not like it's not. It shouldn't be a surprise that NAGPRA was passed so late because giving any sort of human rights effectively to indigenous people in the United States was not a thing that we did until relatively late in the 20th century.
We as a country, I get to be critical because I live here. We as a country are very bad about human rights, like in general, and we've been that way since the founding of the country. I'm just gonna say that.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's
we don't like to give. We don't like to treat people equally, and we don't like to give rights to groups that we have picked on in the past. And I think some of that has to do with just American culture in general. Like, I think we have a really shitty, toxic culture in general. Um, and I think that, but I think it's like, oh, if I've treated these people like crap for so long, if I make them equal, what if they come after me? And it's like, well, A, you deserve it, and B, why do you assume they're going to come after you? They just want to be treated like everybody else. Um, so that's where that I personally think that's why that took so long and why it still takes so long. I mean, there's a group of people that believe that once NAGPRA got passed, that now we live in like this post racism world where all Native Americans are not racially discriminated against, and it's just like that NAGPRA didn't solve that problem.
no,
NAGPRA didn't even like really touch that problem. I
no,
don't
no.
think NAGPRA has anything to do with that. Um, but there are a lot of
Um,
people that seem to believe that that's what NAGPRA does.
yes, yeah. Um, related, I'm going to answer another question that just popped up in the chat.
Please do, please do.
I'm going to go ahead and read it since we're recording this. Um, NAGPRA sounds amazing. Can I ask? Stewardship standards are a big issue with repatriation here in Canada, just like museums have standards for storage, like fire systems and climate control. The concerns are that artifacts will not be stored safely. Does the US have stewardship as an issue in relation to NAGPRA? NAGPRA specifically, so I think there might be in the US, I think maybe there is a little bit more of a disconnect, it sounds like, between stewardship and curation. So there are curation standards in the US, but those are not at all defined by NAGPRA. If I remember correctly, those are mostly defined by ARPA, which is the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, which was passed just before NAGPRA. Um, and so NAGPRA itself does not address those kinds of issues. The way that I, as someone who has always worked in the US and works in NAGPRA, the way that I would view stewardship would be something like a curation agreement that you might put into place after a collection has been repatriated. So there are situations in which a tribe may not be able to take physical possession of their ancestors or archaeological materials for a variety of reasons. And so you can still repatriate things
Mm.
without physically giving them to someone else or moving them to a different place. So that is a big misconception for a lot of people. Repatriation really is is a legal word, and it means effectively a transfer of ownership. And so you can repatriate ancestral remains or cultural items, and you can still curate them on behalf of a tribe
Mhm.
if that is what they want you to do. There are a variety of ways that you can do that. And so that's something that really surprises a lot of people, that repatriation does not actually require a physical transfer. It often results in a physical transfer, but if a tribe says, "Hey, we really want to rebury these ancestors, but we just don't have the space right now, or we're really busy because there's a pipeline coming through, and we don't
Not a
we don't have
pipeline.
anybody we don't have anybody that we can send to come escort them home. Could you hang on to them until we're ready to do that?" And then so that would be something that I would consider to be stewardship, would be agreeing formally with a tribe that you are in physical possession of their ancestors or of an archaeological or ethnographic collection that belongs to them,
Mm.
but you are sort of stewarding it for them for an agreed upon amount of time.
So no, we don't require groups who are receiving their stuff back to have a curation or standard storage system in place. It's their stuff. When they get it, they can do what they want with it. It's theirs. And
Right.
we're not gonna tell somebody no, you can't have your stuff back because you can't curate it properly.
There are
I like camera because you can see me
I
doing that.
know, air
Um,
quotes. There are certainly museums and institutions who behave that way,
yes, yes,
and I won't name any names,
it's fine. It's fine.
but it's not a secret to a lot of people in the archaeological community, the kinds of places that do things like that. Um, and so that I would say that probably does still happen, but certainly not to the degree that it would have in the past couple decades.
And I don't
Um,
think ours is nearly as bad as Britain, who just refuses to give things back. Um,
yeah, that's international repatriation law is basically non-existent,
that is true.
um, which I'm a proponent of international repatriation, but it would be outrageously complicated to write a repatriation policy that is applicable to all foreign countries.
Mm-hmm.
So in a sense, I understand why it can be so complicated. However, on a case by case basis, you can repatriate things internationally, and it's not going to kill you. We just really don't, and not we in Americans, but
I
nobody likes to repatriate internationally.
I was just laughing at the CRM comment that popped up in chat. Yeah, no, we when we spoke with Bonnie Yates, oh God, last year. What year is it? And Donnie Yates specializes in stolen artifacts and international transfer of stolen artifacts. Uh, she talked briefly about Native American and First Nation objects that make their way overseas, and
Mm-hmm.
it's impossible basically to get that stuff back. Especially since a lot of places are like, oh well, if you have paperwork that shows that there's
Yeah.
trail of possession and blah blah blah, then obviously you're the legal owner of it. And it's just like, oh yeah, because forged documents, those never existed. Um,
Well, and it's also an issue of most of these things were looted in the first place. Of course,
exactly,
the original source communities are not going to have the paperwork.
exactly. Well, and why would they have the paperwork if they're stuff?
Right.
Do you have the paperwork of every little thing that's in your house?
Well, there
Um,
was the recent example of, I cannot at all remember what European country it was asked to repatriate I think it was a headdress
oh wow.
um, from a either Mexican or Central American community, if I remember correctly. I'm gonna have to find the link and put it in the chat now. that was made. It was this outrageously long, beautiful, I think it was Quetzal feathers
Oh, neat.
headdress.
Huh?
And the argument that the museum made was that it could not be appropriately transported back to the Americas. So it couldn't be repatriated. And I wanted to be like, I know you all took it over there on a boat.
Right?
And if
Had,
it could get there,
did you
I'm
teleport it?
yeah, I'm sure you, but you know, these kind of arguments continue to be
Yes,
used.
yes, yes, yes. People don't
Even if
like.
it's actually we know it's yours, but sorry, you still can't have it back because of XYZ reason that I probably just made up.
Probably. We really like them and we like looking at it a lot and we don't want to not be able to look at it, so you can't have it. This is my
Mm-hmm.
thing with human remains being on display, uh, especially here in the States, because we've had. Oh, thanks, Harusaki-man. Thank you. Um, I lost my train of thought. Human remains being on display. We've been asked not to do it, and we also know the political bullshit as to why we only show non-white bodies usually on display. Um, but it's the same kind of thing. Like people want to argue with me as to why we can't not do it, because how will we learn about death and mortuary practices if we don't have bones? And it's like there are a lot of ways to do that do not require you to display people.
Right.
So I'm gonna have to go through the chat and pull all the links out. Um, okay, so we're getting on there in time. We've talked about the history of Nagpra. We've talked about the reality of Nagpra. Um, what are some things you'd like to see if you could write the perfect Nagpra fix bill? You know, Krystiana's fix it bill for Nagpra. What would you change?
I
What
was
would?
hoping you wouldn't do that.
Oh, well,
Uh,
if you don't want to answer it, that's fine. You don't have to. You can just be like pass, hard pass, swipe
there.
left.
So, I mean, I think a lot of people would agree that one of the major issues with the law, and you already mentioned that you feel this way about it, is that it's not the I wasn't going to use the word punishment, but effectively the penalties for not complying with the law are not nearly strong enough.
Mm-hmm.
You know, especially for like I said, again, I'm not going to name any names, but a lot of the institutions.
Hello. The hell?
Are we back?
You are. Am I back?
I can hear you, but I can't see you.
Okay, that's fine. I think that was Discord.
Well, let's see.
We're still streaming
Oh,
and we're still recording.
yeah, we're still streaming audio.
Hey
Okay.
everybody, give me a second. We'll have video again. It's gonna take about two minutes.
This
Um,
is on brand for 2020. Oh,
honestly, if this is the worst thing that happens, I'm gonna be fine. It'll be fine. Okay, all I need.
okay. Well, for anybody that's watching the video, we have now swapped captions names.
No, we're back. We're back. It's good. It's good. We're back to normal.
Perfect. Yeah, okay. So what I was gonna say was that some of the institutions that would be considered major offenders or are non-compliant with NAGPRA are very large institutions that have a lot of money,
Mm-hmm.
and NAGPRA fines for non-compliance are relatively small.
Mm-hmm.
So if you fine a major research one university, for example, for the most part, they can just eat the fine and it doesn't matter to them, right? Like they can afford it. So this is one of the things with NAGPRA that a lot of people have noted is that it actually the penalties are not strong enough, and
Yes.
so I think that's an immediate area of change that a lot of people would like to see, myself included.
What kind of penalty would you because I remember talking about not this about Nagpra, but about the archaeology protection
Hmm.
law, because it's the same thing. It has no teeth. The fine's
Right.
ridiculous, and everyone knows it, and that's why no one does anything about it. And money can hurt. Money can hurt, but like with the big companies and the big research institutions, they have so much that like
Yeah.
really is there any
I
amount that you can really hit them with that is reasonable that they're
I'm
going
not,
to actually give a shit about?
I'm not interested in financially penalizing research institutions. What I'm interested in is that this is a federal law that they're required to comply with,
Right.
and if they don't get to have federal funding anymore, or they can't get a grant from the National Science Foundation. You know, something that actually hurts research institutions in the way that will actually financially and academically affect them.
I
I don't think that increasing the fine is necessarily going to make that much of a change. But if you say, "Hey, you've had a notice of NAGPRA noncompliance filed against you in the Federal Register, so we can't fund this $17 million NSF grant," they're going to be like, "Oh shit, we got to hire somebody right now."
need to get that fixed.
Like that's effectively what often happens with institutions who are not compliant or behind on their compliance with NAGPRA is that they don't do anything about it until they get threatened with a lawsuit.
Hmm. That was
Um,
going to be my next question. Like, is it effective? Obviously, we're not naming names, but is it effective to name and shame in the public eye? Like, does the public care? Like, I think that's another issue we run up against with NAGPRA and a lot of laws dealing with our.
well, so one of the issues with NAGPRA in a public sense is that most people don't know about it. Part of that is because I think archaeology, in a sense, is ashamed that this has become such a problem.
Hmm. All right.
And so it's not something that most universities and museums advertise that they have a bunch of looted collections that they need to return to their source communities.
True.
And so this is not the kind of thing that is often talked about in a public sense. Um, and so I would say, you know, I don't necessarily know that because of that. I don't necessarily know that naming and shaming works in a huge public sense. However, um, in at the beginning of this year, there was a big sort of NAGPRA. I don't know if scandal is quite the right word, but Vassar College
Bing.
Coast
Oh yeah, Vassar.
had a big sort of NAGPRA blow up,
Yeah.
and the student body heard about it and was very upset. And there were a couple of articles published about it in the student newspaper, and students talked about it in their final projects for classes. And
Nice.
students went to the administration. It's not that people don't care; it's just that they don't know about it, and so that they don't know that they should care.
Right. Right. Right.
And so it's not really. And for anybody who's wondering, Vassar is working on their NAGPRA compliance. This was an issue with a faculty member who retired. Um, but it was one of those. Yeah, it was one where nobody on campus seems to have any idea what was going on because people don't talk about NAGPRA because it's embarrassing to be 30 years behind on your compliance work.
Hmm.
And so it is a public issue in that sense, but it's not a public issue just in that the public often doesn't know anything about it.
And I think for me, one of the things I really want to hammer home because I'm old and I don't like being reminded of that. Um, NAGPRA, it is 30 years old and it has been around for 30 years. And yeah, it needs to be better. But it's also only 30 years old. When we look at other laws that have been passed and that are implemented poorly, I mean, shit, we've got laws that have been on the books for 100, 150 years that we just don't pretend. We didn't, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think we should be surprised that NAGPRA being it can be a pain in the ass for people, especially people who don't want to comply. So we shouldn't be surprised that there's so much apathy for
Well,
it,
I think
which
it's
I think
so
is a shame.
I think it's also partly with NAGPRA an issue of this is again related to the sort of education component of NAGPRA, and people who are not anthropologists often not being aware that NAGPRA exists because of structural racism against Indigenous people in the United States.
Hmm.
And the reason that most archaeological collections of human remains that are at museums and universities exist because they were collected in order to prove the theory that white people were better than other people.
Yeah.
And, you know, eventually we figured out that's bullshit.
Did we?
Um,
Did we? I mean, I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying, did we figure that out? Because I feel like we didn't.
the I should maybe say the anthropological and other scientific theories that white people were better than other people didn't pan out.
Exactly. Thank you.
At that point, there were all of these huge university and museum collections of human remains that were mostly not of white people,
Hmm.
because God forbid you dig your own ancestors up and study
Well,
them.
those people were
Uh,
giving Christian burials. You can't disrupt that.
right, yeah, can't touch those. Um, and so the reason that this is a problem is because of that history. And so NAGPRA was passed partly to address that history. And one of the reasons that people, I say people sort of speaking broadly, aren't interested in complying with NAGPRA is because those archaeological collections and human remains are still, for the large majority, controlled by white people.
Yeah.
And that's a whole separate problem, but it's obviously very much related.
Yeah.
And so the continued fight against repatriation is typically related to that specific issue.
Hmm. I want to ask before I let you go, because I know I promised you an hour and we're coming up on it, but
We
there's
can talk a little bit longer than that if
I
you
was gonna
want.
say there's still stuff to talk about. I used to live really close to DC, and so I was able to go into DC fairly frequently. Nice things about that is the museums are free. Um, and one of my favorite museums to go to when am in DC, there you go, is the Museum of the Native American. I think it's an absolutely beautiful museum. I like the way they have things laid out. Um, I like the food they serve in the cafe.
Food in the
Uh,
cafe.
they have amazing food in that
Really
cafe.
great.
But that is me experiencing that museum as someone who is not directly connected to any of the artifacts or the cultures or the peoples that are being represented in that museum. So, and I am also not entirely aware of how involved the tribes are with that.
Yeah, I can
So,
talk about it a little bit.
yeah, so I wanted to know if you could, because I personally am impressed, but that doesn't mean that it's an impressive museum.
Yeah, NMAI is a very impressive museum, to confirm your immediate impression for you.
That makes me feel
Um,
better because now I can be like, oh, go to the museum. It's amazing.
yeah, so the Smithsonian museums, this will become relevant. The Smithsonian museums are not subject to NAGPRA because they have their own version of NAGPRA, which is the National Museum of the American Indian Act, which also created the National Museum of the American Indian. Um, and and
I'm,
that museum is uh, they invite indigenous guest curators to create
oh,
exhibits.
good. Okay.
Um, and it's really fabulous, and they have no NAGPRA materials in their collections.
Okay.
So they're sort of a brand new kind of museum for the US and for DC especially, and for the Smithsonian especially in that sense. The American Museum of Natural History, of course, is the big one that
Yeah.
has the majority of the Smithsonian's NAGPRA collections. But because the NMAI is very focused on indigenous created exhibits and allowing um, tribal representatives to create exhibits and represent collections and represent their people in ways that are comfortable for them and that are appropriate for them, they don't curate NAGPRA materials at that specific museum, even though, based on its name, you might think that they did.
I wondered if they did. What I really, and now that makes sense as to why I really like the displays at the museum. They have just, they're really cool. And
They're
I
very
feel
fabulous.
I feel like they're way more informative. I have a lot to bitch about museums for. One of them being like you can walk
Not
around
one
a
bitch.
you can walk around a museum all damn day and you have no idea what the hell you're looking at. But
It's
the
it's almost like having people represent themselves works better.
Yeah, crazy. I know it's don't know where someone came up with that idea. I
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, the displays at the Native American Museum are just they're informative, they're neat. You can you get a question at the beginning of the it, and it's answered throughout the entire display. It's respectful. It felt respectful, and I'm glad that it truly is because that makes me feel better. Which is all that's really important in the world, so that I feel good about myself. Um, I do remember that's where the theater is that's upstairs. I think it's on the fourth floor, the theater up there.
Yeah.
It's incredibly moving. I don't cry very well. I don't cry at all. And I tear up a little bit when I go there, and it's just like, oh, I can't stay in the room. Um, but yeah, it's a very good museum. You guys should totally go. Apparently, it's not a POS museum.
No,
Um,
everyone go. It's the best museum in DC. I shouldn't say that. I also really, really like the
I was,
Holocaust Museum. They're
I
both
haven't
great.
I haven't been to the Holocaust Museum, but I have been able to go to the African American Museum, and damn, that's a good one too.
Oh, yeah.
If you can go to both of those, that's a day for you. I would encourage people to go and check out the Native American Museum, and then also go to the Natural History Museum and the American History Museum, um, and compare what you see there, and compare how things are displayed there,
I
because
like it.
yeah, you'll see what we're saying. Um, but I think I'm done with my rant about museums.
That was
Anything?
pretty.
I have opinions. God damn it. Um, is there anything else you want to touch on? You have the floor. Someday post
Uh,
COVID. There's a post
well,
COVID day.
while we're like sort of in a sense wrapping up, if anybody has any other questions they
Yes.
want to post, please feel free to do that, and we can answer those. I think that we had a couple questions in the Discord earlier about Royce maps.
Yes, I was going to ask you about Royce maps and then completely
Um,
forgot to.
so we can pretty. I
What
could
is a
talk about.
what's a Royce
I could
map?
yeah, I could talk about this all day long, but I won't. So talking about Royce maps and treaties, and
Okay.
so Royce maps are a collection of maps of every state that effectively include treaty boundaries.
Okay.
Um, yeah, feel free to contact me later. So Royce,
We're not here to make friends, guys. Stop that. I'm kidding.
don't get to make friends. What the hell did I come on here for? Uh, so um, Royce maps are effectively state maps of of very specific treaty boundaries, and they will reference exactly which treaty was signed to cover that area of that state or multiple states, whatever the treaty boundaries are.
Hmm.
And they're often used for NAGPRA um, because most people don't know jack shit about treaties, frankly. Um, and so they're a relatively good resource for figuring out which treaties cover which parts of the U.S.
Okay.
Um,
Because
so
we respect the treaties we
so no,
sign.
but in terms of NAGPRA, so somebody asked about the Royce maps and how they can be used for cultural affiliation in terms of NAGPRA.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, I'm sure that there are people that use them for that. In terms of NAGPRA, I would never say that I would use a Royce map for affiliation. I would use a Royce map to figure out some of the tribes that I should consult with about a particular collection. So let's say I have a collection from Illinois that was excavated from a particular county, and I had no idea who I should consult with about it. I could at least start by looking at the Royce map for Illinois and seeing which treaty covers that county and which tribes signed it, and that would at least give me a place to start.
Start.
So if I can at least look at the treaty to see which tribes lived in that area at least when the treaty was signed, it's a starting point for who to contact. The issue with Royce maps, of course, is that they're from a fixed point in time. Treaties are also from a fixed point in time. That is also during the colonial period when people were already being forced to move around the country.
Mm-hmm.
And NAGPRA means that you have to repatriate archaeological materials from all of American history before European contact and after. You repatriate historic collections also. Those are just typically a little bit less complicated. So, if you have a Royce map from the 17 or 1800s, it's not going to tell you who lived there 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
So if you have a collection from the Archaic period, for example, which is thousands of years ago, for those who don't know U.S. archaeology terminology, Royce maps can't help you at all for that. I mean, they can still give you a first point of contact, but because of Indian removal being so effective and forcing people to move across huge distances of land and way far away from where their ancestors lived in a lot of cases, those are not necessarily the tribes who signed those treaties are not necessarily the tribes whose ancestral homelands those are.
Sure.
In some cases they are, but in some cases they're not, and so they're not a failsafe.
No, but it sounds like they're a decent starting point.
Yeah, treaty maps and Royce maps are a great place to start. And if a collection ends up being culturally unidentifiable, the only tribes who are able to take disposition of those human remains or cultural items are the ones who signed either the treaties or who are listed on Indian Claims Commission documents for that part of the state. And
that was going to be a question I was going to ask and just didn't get. Thank you.
So they're really helpful, but not necessarily for affiliation, if that makes sense.
I think one of the things I want to hit on about the tribal affiliation is it's not up to people from the outside to decide who's affiliated with a tribe, like individual affiliation with a tribe. Tribes themselves have sovereignty and final say over who is and who isn't part of their tribes. And if you are someone who has a question about if you are affiliated with or a member of a tribe just because you're white and you have a great-great-grandmother who was a Navajo princess does not make you Navajo. But if you do have questions about your ancestry, you can. Most tribes have a web presence. Almost all of them that I am aware of have basically a government, and they will. You can contact them, is what I'm trying to say, and you can ask them. Be prepared for whatever answer you're going to get. They're not required to be nice to you, but the tribal maps and the Royce maps and us, we're not the ones who decide who's part of what tribe. That's up to the tribes when it comes to that kind of affiliation, if that was what the question was.
Yeah, and in terms of NAGPRA, the part about NAGPRA that people forget about all the time. So we kind of sort of hinted at this earlier that if a tribe makes a claim for repatriation of a collection or of ancestral remains or other materials, technically the institution can say no, right? That's it. It ends up resting with the institution, which is another flaw of NAGPRA.
Yes.
But when collections are reported to the federal government as being ready for repatriation, which is either a notice of inventory completion or a notice of intent to repatriate, depending on the particular collection. Those documents are required to be prepared by the law, are required to be prepared in consultation with tribes. So even according to the law, archaeologists or anthropologists or other academics are not technically allowed to decide by themselves what is or is not a certain type of object under NAGPRA or what is or is not affiliatable under NAGPRA. You're required to decide that in consultation with tribes.
I think that's really important, though, because personally, I think that's important because I understand that something that may seem insignificant to a particular researcher may not be insignificant to a particular group. So for you to say this thing has value, but this thing doesn't, when it comes to the culture group, it's not really something you get to say. It
Exactly.
archaeology has come very far since its inception. I'm not trying to say it's perfect because it's not. But the way we think about things as archaeologists, the way we're trained now to think about things and to think about people and to think about history and culture, is much, much more open and fluid than it has been in the past. Um, and that kind of gives me a little bit of hope for things like Nagpra because it means like there's people who like outthink me now, and I graduated a while ago, but not that long ago. Um,
Well, to your point,
yeah,
not to talk shit about old people, but every generation of archaeologists is better about that. I mean, it's
yeah,
just true.
yeah, 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 yeah. I think that's where I was going with that.
Mhm.
It's getting better. It's not perfect. It's getting better. And I'm not trying to talk shit on old people. I mean, there are some very open-minded people who have been in the field for a very long time. Um,
Absolutely.
so I mean, it's not hopeless. Um, but yeah, I think at this point I'm just rambling. Do you have? I don't think we have any more questions. See, old people in the chat agree with me. Thank you. Um, the chat. This is your last chance to ask questions.
Last
I
call.
last call for alcohol.
Last call for Nagpra questions.
I'm gonna give it a couple minutes because I know there's a delay.
Yeah, that's totally fine. Uh,
Um,
I would say one of the other things that I think
there you go.
the big misconception about NAGPRA and about affiliation specifically is NAGPRA refers to cultural affiliation decisions
Okay.
uh, as being related to a preponderance of evidence, I think is the phrase that they use, in favor of affiliation. And that's not defined in the law. So often people ask what a preponderance of evidence actually is because
Yeah,
that's
that was gonna be my question.
right. In a lot of hard sciences, you have to have 95% confidence in something, right? You have like a 0.05 is your wiggle room, right? To be actually confident. Um, so we would say like, oh, of course, as scientists, you have to be 95% confident in something. Um, Actually, in NAGPRA, you only have to be 51% confident in something. It just has to be more likely than not.
Well,
Affiliation is not something that is outrageously complicated and that you have to be absolutely certain of. This is something that really shocks people, but this is why I have both a personal and professional opinion that you can affiliate almost any archaeological collection
hmm
due to either just oral histories or if you know which tribes lived in what part of the country that this collection is from. um, it's not rocket science. You just have to be more likely, you have to be more confident than not.
I feel like you're asking too much.
A lot of people would say that.
I
I
know,
think.
I know, I know.
And this is of course extra complicated for really complicated archaeological sites like people point to places like Moundville or Cahokia or Aztalan a lot because there were these big, complex, multicultural centers where it would be admittedly very hard to culturally affiliate those sites to particular groups of people. However, it's not impossible.
It's not.
Especially
But
one of
so
the
go ahead, finish because I have a
I
question.
was say one of the other things that a lot of people don't understand about NAGPRA is that you can affiliate to more than one tribe.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So if you have effectively a group of tribes that says we would like to claim affiliation to this collection,
Okay, that does
it
make
can
sense.
be 10 it can be 10 tribes. You don't have to pick one.
So that probably answers my question then, because my question was, because the sites you mentioned are very old sites, on
Yes.
top of being multicultural, which people also don't understand, but that's a whole other conversation to have. So how do you track that into the modern era? Because the only people we have to repatriate to are the modern tribes, and the modern tribes are not necessarily representative of the ancient and prehistoric tribes. But the question would be, answered with multiple people can be affiliated with that, and that's great. That's actually really cool. I did not know that.
Yeah,
So I
it's
learned things today.
it's actually really it was a very good move in terms of the way that NAGPRA was written, that it does not limit institutions to affiliating collections with one tribe specifically. You can say, well, for a variety of reasons, based on a variety of types of evidence, we think the site is possibly affiliated to this, and this tribe, and that's fine. You can do that. You can jointly give it back to all of them.
Good, good, good. Because I mean, that's what you would have to do with sites like
Mhm.
Cahokia and any of the big.
Absolutely.
It's just in my mind, it would be impossible to nail it down to any one particular group. But if you can nail it down to a large group of people, that's much more reasonable. Um.
Hmm.
All right. You have let me eat up an hour, almost an hour and a half of your evening. I truly appreciate this. I hope everyone has enjoyed this grand experiment that was my first live show ever. Uh, I apologize for my camera. I'm a ghost. It's just what it is.
I'm
Uh,
thrilled to be your tag.
is there anywhere, because we had this conversation, is there anywhere people can get a hold of you should they have questions that isn't the Discord? Because the
That
Discord,
isn't the Discord.
yeah,
Yeah.
the Discord's only
Um,
for special people.
so you can find me either by Googling my name,
Okay.
which is the easy way out this time. But so I have I'll put my my personal or not my personal my work email
I was gonna
since
say,
I'll put my work email in the chat on Twitch, and
okay.
if anybody wants to contact me about anything, you're welcome to do that.
Okay.
Um,
Would you be okay
and
with me putting that in the show notes for the show when it goes live?
sure, that's fine. Um, you can also, if you're interested, the NAGPRA office at Illinois has a website. We're at nagpra.illinois.edu. Like I said, we're a very young office, so I can't say that there's a whole hell of a lot of information on there that might be of interest to a ton of you, but for some of you, you might want to check it out. So that also exists,
Good.
and you're welcome to reach out to me about anything NAGPRA related anytime.
Only Nagpra stuff though, for reals, people.
Only NAGPRA. Only NAGPRA. If you want to talk about anything else, you have to use the
You
Discord.
have to use the Discord. And if you're not on the Discord,
Hmm.
hmm.
Hmm,
So
indeed.
again, thank you for joining us. Thanks everybody for being in the chat and having a lively discussion in there as well. Really, K-pop? You're gonna drop that right before I go off air? Anyway,
Talk
uh,
about Discord.
oh, I can go on about K-pop. There's so much to talk about. You don't even understand. Anyway, we're leaving on that. Thank you guys. See you next time.